Hey there, it's Kelly from Kelly's Astrology here. I've had so many questions from students and clients in the past few weeks about the coronavirus, COVID-19, that I wanted to take a few minutes and just share some of my initial thoughts about how astrology might connect to the experiences that we're all having. I have shared a lot of this information in a really detailed blog post, which I'm going to link below. But if you also like my style of astrology, do take a moment to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you make sure to stay up to date with all of my latest videos. All right, so there are two parts that I want to address in relation to astrology and COVID-19. The first is the kind of immediate change in our day-to-day reality. The second part has to do with the economic situation. So when I first wrote about this on my website over at kellysastrology.com, I made a point that I wasn't trying to define or track the disease itself. What I wanted to do instead was to use astrology to help describe our day-to-day experiences. And one of the things that I have long been watching and observing in regards to the astrology of 2020, and I wasn't quite sure how it would pan out, but I was very aware, as many of my colleagues were, that Mars and Saturn were going to spend an extra long time together moving through the zodiac. Usually every 2 years, Mars will come to meet Saturn in whatever sign Saturn is transiting through, and they'll spend about 6 weeks traveling together. So normally, under normal situations, we have Mars and Saturn together in the same sign, which is called a co-presence, for about 6 weeks every 2 years. However, in 2020, as Saturn changes signs, Mars does too. So we actually have this unusual 12-week-long, almost 3-month period where Mars and Saturn are traveling together in the same signs in the zodiac. The first time frame is when Mars and Saturn are together in Capricorn, and that is from mid-February to late March. Then we have the second 6-week period, which starts late March and runs right through until mid-May. So that's where we get this 3-month period, basically starting mid-February and running through to mid-May. Now, Saturn has a lot of power. He has a lot of dignity. Saturn in Capricorn or Saturn in Aquarius in the traditional system of astrology is Saturn in the sign of his rulership. So even though Mars is exalted in Capricorn and not in Aquarius, in either scenario, Mars is having to follow the orders and the example set by Saturn. In astrology, Saturn is the planet of isolation, of being distant, being a hermit, being separate from, being alone. So being cut off, if you like, can be a Saturnian type thing. And it feels a little bit like we're all getting a masterclass in Saturn right now, whether we like it or not, that collectively, for the good of the health of everyone, we're being asked to distance ourselves, to isolate. We're being asked to do Saturn things, to stay at home, to make like a hermit. Funnily enough, we're all going to be using, and we are using the internet to stay connected. And the internet, well, the World Wide Web, should I say, was born with Saturn in Aquarius. And in fact, the World Wide Web is having its Saturn return as Saturn goes into Aquarius. So it's super interesting that all this isolation, Saturn type behavior that we're being forced into or just choosing to do for the good of everyone is manifesting in this extra demand and use on the internet right at the time when the internet is having its Saturn returns. That's a little sidebar. But in terms of contraction and restriction, the closer that Mars gets to Saturn, the more restriction and tightness and limits we're going to see. Now, since mid-February, Mars has been moving towards Saturn. Saturn moves quite slowly. And so as soon as Mars moved into Capricorn, he has been heading into this meeting with Saturn. Now, Saturn will actually leave Capricorn just before Mars gets to him and move into Aquarius. That's happening on Saturday, March 21st. And then Mars will move into Aquarius on Monday, March 30th. And on Monday, March 31st, Mars and Saturn will make a conjunction. They will meet, they'll join together at 0 degrees of Aquarius. That represents a low point or a bottom, if you like. We're talking in stock market terms. That is when things hit their lowest ebb. Now, when I work with clients about Saturn transits, when we talk about those Saturn conjunctions, we talk about somebody being at their lowest ebb, at being in the dark night of the soul, or being in the point where things feel most bleak or most limiting. And also when we can be most filled with fear, worry, and anxiety, which are all Saturn type things. So as we get closer to that Mars-Saturn conjunction, there is this increase in the collective, if you like, where we are more worried, we're more fearful, we're more afraid. We're more afraid of the Grim Reaper, of this disease causing death to someone we love, to ourselves, etc. And that idea of the Grim Reaper is a manifestation of Saturn as well. So we're all a lot more worried about that, understandably so. Once Mars and Saturn come through that conjunction and Mars starts to slowly but surely pull away from Saturn, energetically, we start to see distance between Mars and the planet of holding and limitation and restriction. It will take some time, at least a week after that Mars-Saturn conjunction, for Mars to be far enough from Saturn that the effects of that could start to be felt. And so at the earliest, Mars moving about 3 or 4 degrees beyond that conjunction with Saturn is a time where we might feel we have gone through the peak, or the curve is starting to flatten rather than go right up. But it may take until that mid-May period, until Mars leaves the sign ruled by Saturn, before many of the extreme restrictions that have been put in place as Mars was getting closer to Saturn, it may take Mars getting all that distance beyond Saturn before those restrictions lift. I'm hopeful, as always, that some of the astrological changes towards the end of April and even in early May might help hasten that. But the cautious part of me is like, Mars is not out of the Saturn woods until May 13, and we too may be living with this increased sense of restriction until May 13 ourselves. But I wanted to make the point that it varies. It's intensifying up until March 31st, and then it starts to lessen in intensity. The way the human psyche works is we worry about things getting worse and worse until they get to a point where it's like, this is absolutely the worst. And then we're like, okay, we're in it. We haven't died, or the worst that we worried about hasn't happened. And we're still in this really intense situation. And then we just somehow flip around and we figure out a way to accept or to just operate within whatever restrictions there are. So I don't know that the restrictions go away magically on April 1st, but somehow we've got a sense of it, and there is a clarity that gives us whatever information we need to look for further forward. So there's the Mars-Saturn piece that I wanted to address in terms of our restrictions over daily life. Now that's kind of part 1 of Mars-Saturn, because there will be a part 2 in the second half of the year, unfortunately. Mars and Saturn will be in an extended sign-based square from early July 2020 to early January of 2021. So there is still some restrictional pressure happening at that time. Now, Mars will be in Aries, Saturn will be in Capricorn. Both planets will be in the sign of their rulership. However, Saturn will be in what's known as an overcoming square to Mars in Aries at that time. And that again gives Saturn the upper hand. Now, I don't think the entire second half of the year has the extreme quality of what we're experiencing now, but there is a particular 6-week period in the second half of the year where the pressure of Saturn may come down quite hard on Mars and therefore perhaps the rest of us. And this time frame runs from the last 10 days of August all through September and includes the first 7 to 10 days of October. So if you think about a 6-week period starting late August and running until early October, the reason I've highlighted that period is that Mars will be in a degree-based square to Saturn then. Mars will be within about 3 degrees of Saturn, and Mars will start his retrograde in the middle of September. So Mars will make an exact square to Saturn in early September while still direct, and then we'll make another exact square to Saturn in late September, early October while Mars is retrograde. But really, Mars is never more than about 3 degrees away from Saturn in that entire 6-week period. And that is the range, in Hellenistic astrology at least, for aspects to be their most potent. So I do, when I did my year ahead webinars and trainings in January, I did highlight these 2 periods from mid-February to mid-May when Mars and Saturn were in an extended co-presence, as well as the late August to early October period when Mars and Saturn form that ongoing square, as being 2 of the more difficult, problematic or restrictive cycles this year. Now, I had no idea that it would look exactly like this. I just knew that we would be dealing with more restriction in some capacity, that we'd have to do what Saturn wanted. We'd have to think big picture, long term. We'd have to give up short term desires and dreams, which are Mars stuff, to do whatever the priority of Saturn is. Saturn also represents the collective. In Capricorn, it definitely represents government, so social structures like health agencies and things like that. So that's part of where we're at. I did want to touch very briefly on the economic impact. For a number of years, many of my astrology colleagues across all disciplines in astrology had been talking about economic problems for 2020. One of the reasons for that had been the transit of Jupiter through Capricorn. The last time we had Jupiter in Capricorn was in 2008, when we did have quite an economic crash at that time. In 2020, Jupiter makes 3 conjunctions to the planet Pluto, one in April, one in late June and July, and then another in November. So Jupiter in Capricorn, intensified and therefore given more potency and power by those conjunctions to Pluto, does indicate some massive overhauls in the financial systems and structures within society. Again, I don't know that I certainly didn't predict that it would happen via this global health crisis with the pandemic. Perhaps some of my colleagues did. I don't recall anyone mentioning that, but if somebody has that you've heard of, please do let me know in the comments below. So the two things I think operate a little bit differently. Regardless of the path that COVID-19, the virus spread itself, takes, the economic impact has already hit. Airline industry, hospitality, entertainment industries falling apart and may take a long time to recover if they ever do. The health system in many countries is being shown, for what works well and for where it's been seriously underfunded and isn't working. Jupiter in Capricorn does represent services or benefits that we receive from our government. And this is highlighting where those things are not up to standard or haven't been maintained at the levels required, for real safety, if you like. And so I think Jupiter-Pluto is indicating that the economic cycles may diverge a little. It's interesting that the Mars-Saturn with the virus and the day-to-day restriction running from mid-February to mid-May, and within that we have the Jupiter-Pluto in early April. So it's like the two things kind of start around the same time or definitely interconnected at the beginning, but then they diverge in that Jupiter-Pluto will be active mid-year, the Mars-Saturn again kind of that late August through to early October, and then we have Jupiter-Pluto at the end of the year again. There is a lot going on in 2020. I have been saying, and I believe this even more now than ever, 2021 is a whole different kettle of fish, and the new mindset that is emerging right now as Saturn comes into Aquarius about community orientation, collaboration, and the fact that it doesn't matter how wealthy a society is, if there aren't services and infrastructures in place to support those at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, nobody has any protection at all. And I think if we can orient towards systems that are going to support everyone, regardless of financial means, we're going to end up in a better place ultimately. We just have to dismantle some really outdated systems that certain people with a lot of money are very interested in maintaining. And that's what we're seeing with Jupiter and Pluto, the change and the transition of money and wealth and what that does or doesn't do within society. But day to day, there is going to be economic cutbacks. And so I appreciate that so many of you are dealing with concerns about financial stability, as in addition to worries about your health. So I know this isn't necessarily the most motivating astro video, but I've had so many questions on this subject that I just wanted to share a few thoughts to let you know what I'm thinking about and the timelines that I've got in the back of my mind that are helping me plan and prepare for this year, in the hopes that they can help you plan and prepare as well. If you have any further questions on anything going on in 2020, do pop them in the chat box below, in the comments below. Take a moment to subscribe to my channel, and I'll also link to the blog post where I go into some of these cycles in more detail in case you want to look at that. All right, take care, stay safe, keep washing your hands, and we'll be in touch soon.